Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on CMMC. So we're really happy to have you here today. And so we have our guest, Jason Reed, who's going to be telling us all about the current conditions and what you can do to manage the Certified Maturity Model certification process. Okay, so just let you know who is presenting this webinar today. Our sponsors are Strategic Value Plus in partnership with RTB Technologies and the KDM Consortium. Strategic Value Plus helps small and mid-sized U.S. manufacturers close the gaps that stand between them and OEM and federal contracts, which include quality, delivery, and compliance readiness. Our CRO, Roy Dickens, is a CMMC registered practitioner and leads our compliance advisory work, which is especially timely given where things stand with CMMC right now. KDM Consortium is a federal procurement and industrial readiness center built around 5 pillars: government, contracting, manufacturing, critical minerals opportunity zones, and access to capital. KDM has supported 475 plus clients and brings over $50 billion in associated transaction experience, helping businesses navigate certifications, strategic teaming, and capture. Together, V Plus and KDM give manufacturers both the technical readiness and the contracting pathway they need, which is why we're glad to have Jason Reed joining us today to dig into CMMC. Jason Reed's a co-founder and a fractional chief security officer with RTB Technologies, a cybersecurity governance firm helping organizations build cybersecurity programs that stand up to legal, insurance, client, and regulatory scrutiny. Our former U.S. Air Force Cyber Operations Officer and now a CMMC registered practitioner, Jason helps executive teams move cybersecurity beyond technical checklists and into strategic business governance. His focus is helping leaders understand risk, verify that security controls are working as intended, and build programs they can confidently stand behind. Jason, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Great to be here, Nell. I appreciate that. Thank you for that introduction. I want to thank you, the entire Strategic Value Plus team, the KDM Consortium for letting me present today. I'm very excited about it. Now, before this, she said, well, you should tell people what RTB stands for, like how it came to be. And so RTB Technologies, that's the company that my co-founder and I founded over 7 years ago. And RTB stands for Return to Base. So it's designed to be a little shout out to our Air Force lineage and how we got started in this whole cybersecurity journey. So it's been great. And I'm excited to be here today. So
yes, thank you so much, Jason. And so I'll let you take the stage.
Okay, sounds good. How about, I want to make sure that everything is working correctly. Can you do me a favor, make sure that you can hear me, see me, and my screen? I'm sharing my screen, but I'm not sure that it's up.
Yes.
Make sure.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, there we go.
Yes, and we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Well, again, I'm super excited to be here today, and I thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. So this presentation will take somewhere around 45 minutes. So I don't expect you to become a CMMC expert during our time together, but my goal is to make sure that you leave here today with an understanding of the questions that your organization should be asking, what your leadership needs to know, what responsible action looks like, while this regulatory landscape that we're in continues to evolve. So we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So if you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and type them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end. Like I said, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the status of CMMC right now, as well as perhaps how you fit into the puzzle. So my goal today is to shed some light on what's going on. Nobody really knows what exactly the future holds. So I want to provide you with the value and the knowledge that you need to make the best decisions for your organization and where to go from here. So I'm sure what's really on your mind is what the pause means for your responsibility. So on July 13th of 2026, the Department of War, and throughout this presentation, I might use the Department of War and Department of Defense interchangeably, or maybe just call it the department. So just understand that those terms are synonymous right now. But in July, the department suspended the CMMC Phase 2 requirements that were scheduled to begin in November. So understandably, many organizations heard that announcement and felt some sort of relief, right? Some began reconsidering budgets. Others paused projects. Others concluded that they had more time. So today I want to distinguish between two very different things: the assessment timeline and the responsibility that the cybersecurity claims your organization makes. So in other words, the timeline changed, but the responsibility did not. So most CMMC conversations, and again, CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So that's a very important acronym. But most conversations around CMMC begin with some form of this question, right? Which is understandable because this certification affects your eligibility for contracts, and you want to know you can pass. But the deeper executive question is whether you can support the claims that you're making about your cybersecurity posture. This session is about that second question. So to put it into perspective, I want to start with a couple of examples, right, to give background on why the CMMC program exists. So there are quite a few examples out there that I could have chosen from, so I just picked a couple. But they both illustrate that the theft of intellectual property lets our adversaries and/or our competitors skip that research and development process and go straight into operational development. So this first one here is about the DuPont titanium dioxide manufacturing process. So there was a gentleman named Walter Liu, and he and his company were convicted of economic espionage and trade secret theft involving DuPont's proprietary chloride route process for manufacturing titanium dioxide. So this gentleman, Walter Liu, ended up being convicted and is serving a 15-year sentence right now. The second one, look, it's our F-35. But wait a second. Look a little bit closer. Those are not our tail markings. And that's because this is a Shenyang J-35A. It debuted at a Chinese air show in 2024. So Chinese actors have been convicted of conspiring to steal this technical information associated with the F-35 and other US military aircraft. So China later developed stealth fighters bearing notable similarities, as you can see, to American designs. And although the public record does not conclusively establish which stolen technologies were incorporated into any particular aircraft, we can deduce that this is happening, and it's something that we need to be very leery of. So, as Nell said, I'm a former Air Force cyber operations officer, and in my role, I led Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, which is now a Space Force base, through a cyber readiness inspection. And this was very similar to CMMC. It has many of the same standards applied to us, with the addition of other standards for safeguarding secret and top secret information. But well before the acronym CMMC existed, we were discussing the same underlying problem. So our military cyber teams became increasingly effective at hardening our military networks and our critical systems. So our adversaries adapted. They recognized that valuable information is distributed across a much broader supply chain, including engineering firms, manufacturers, software providers, subcontractors, and service organizations. So that means that the easier path is not always through the front door of a military network. It's through an organization that is trusted to hold part of that same mission information. So CMMC was not created because the department wanted more documents. It was created because that threat had shifted. And as a hacker, the easiest thing to do is to start at those bottom levels and swim upstream. So the government's first response to this problem was not CMMC. It was to establish safeguarding requirements through contracts. And I remember having these conversations in the 2014 timeframe about possible cyber threats to the Air Force base level through vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And I'm sure there were higher up conversations about this risk even earlier than that. So around the 2016, 2017 timeframe, before CMMC existed, defense contractors are already required to protect covered information through DFARS. And for covered contractor information systems, that clause required the implementation of NIST Special Publication 800-171. And that had the implementation deadline of December 31st in 2017. So the important point here is that CMMC did not invent the underlying safeguarding requirement. Contractors were already responsible for implementing those requirements and representing their condition to the government. So the duty to protect controlled unclassified information existed before CMMC. The challenge here is confidence. How is the government supposed to know whether those requirements are actually being implemented across a supply chain containing hundreds of thousands of organizations? So the next stage attempted to improve that visibility into the implementation. And over time, the department added mechanisms intended to improve visibility and verification. So like I said, that first NIST implementation deadline appeared in 2017. But then in 2020, that NIST assessment methodology created a SIPRS scoring mechanism and a common method for contractors to report implementation. So SIPRS here stands for Supplier Performance Risk System, because ultimately the government wants to know how much risk a supplier is bringing on by aggregating that supplier risk data, such as delivery and quality performance, price risk, item risk, and of course, cybersecurity risk. Then in 2020 to 2021, CMMC added a certification model. It's designed to provide that greater confidence through independent assessments for organizations. So remember, CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And then in 2021, that original model was revised to CMMC 2.0 and followed by a rulemaking and a phased implementation plan. So then in 2024, the final rules were released for the phased implementation. And then in July of 2026, the department suspended the phase 2 and initiated another comprehensive review. So, we can debate whether each version found that right balance between cost, access to the industrial base, and cybersecurity assurance. But the history here reveals something important. Every iteration has been trying to solve the same confidence problem. Does this organization's stated cybersecurity posture match its actual operating condition? So that brings us to the July 13th pause announcement and the distinction that matters most for this session. The CMMC program continues, but phase 2 is paused. Specifically, the phase 2 expansion of mandatory third-party certification assessments was suspended. So if you remember anything from this presentation, is that the phase 2 pause suspended the mandatory third-party certification assessments, but the CMMC program itself, including the phase 1 requirements, remain in effect. So that November 10th, 2026 phase 2 start is paused, and a comprehensive CMMC review was launched so that the cost and barriers to DIB, to the defense industrial base participation, can be evaluated. So the stated goals here include reducing barriers, lowering burdens on small and non-traditional businesses, and aligning the program with a broader acquisition reform. That's a meaningful change if you think about that. But the department did not announce that CMMC disappeared. And that means that the phase 1 self-assessment requirements remain in place. And we're about to get more into what did not change here. So obviously, some things were paused, but the column on the right shows what's still in force. So you still have DFARS obligations to safeguard contractual obligations. The NIST enforcement will continue, and as will your current assessment at award and ongoing SIPR's responsibilities, which again is the Supplier Performance Risk System portal. So the phase one self-assessment requirements remain in place, which is a very important point that will be a theme here today. And then we have the government-led assessments. And honestly, I have no idea what their capacity is or what criteria determines if they will initiate that government-led assessment. But of course, the responsibility for accurate representations. And if you think about it, this is always the case for dealing with the government, whether we're talking about local, state, or federal. Affirmations are attached to organizational leadership. So in other words, the forcing function of the November deadline changed, but the underlying duty did not. And this leads us to what we can call the signature problem. So we spent the first part of this conversation discussing the history, the timelines, and the requirements. But regulations do not sign affirmations. People do. And the CMMC rule defines the affirming official as a senior level representative of the organization who is responsible for ensuring compliance with the applicable CMMC requirements and has the authority to affirm continuing compliance. So this matters because the affirmation here is not just an IT status update. It's an organizational representation made by somebody with sufficient authority to speak on behalf of the company. So the leadership here, they might rely on technical teams, outside providers, internal documentation, assessment results, right? But at that moment of affirmation, a person is attaching their name to that organization's stated condition. Which leads us to a question I believe every executive team should answer before that next affirmation is due. Could your executive team confidently sign today? So we're not talking about 3 months of document cleanup or after a consultant has assembled last-minute evidence package, but today. Does leadership know which controls are operating? So in other words, what's been implemented? Does it know which controls are incomplete? Does that SIPR score reflect the actual condition of the environment? Can we explain our decisions? And does that SSP, that system security plan, accurately describe the systems, the boundaries, and the practices in use? And other considerations here are whether the remaining deficiencies are visible, prioritized, funded, and tracked. Because confidence should not come from being told, we should be fine, right? It should come from a repeatable governance process that allows leadership to see the condition of that program. And that confidence comes from understanding the difference between the stated posture, which is what's being reported, and the operating reality, which is what is actually being implemented and what's actually happening. And your risk and liability exposure lives in that gap in between. So most organizations don't intentionally create two versions of themselves, right? This gap happens gradually. And examples of this include a policy that is written but never operationalized, that system security plan that reflects the intended architecture, but the environment changes. Or maybe a vendor says a control is verified, or that control is covered, but nobody verifies how it's configured. Or the POAM, which is the plan of action and milestones. That POAM remains open, but leadership stops reviewing it. Or maybe that SIPR score is calculated once and then treated as permanent. But over time, documentation starts describing one company while the live systems reveal another. And that gap is where the contractual, the operational, and the legal exposure begins. So the purpose of governance is to keep the stated posture and that operating reality aligned. And we don't have to speculate about what that gap can look like. There's now a very clear public example that we'll use as a case study. So in January 2021, Morse Corporation submitted to the Department of Defense a SIPR score of 104 for its implementation of NIST security controls. And 104, that score is near the top of a possible score range from 110 on the high end to negative 203 on the low end. And then in July of 22, a third-party cybersecurity consultant notified Morse that its score was actually a negative 142. And Morse didn't update that score in the DoD reporting system until June of 23. So almost a year later. And 3 months after the United States served Morse with a subpoena concerning its cybersecurity practices. And then in 2025, Morse agreed to pay $4.6 million to resolve a False Claims Act allegations related to the cybersecurity requirements in Army and Air Force contracts. And this is important. The official DOJ, the Department of Justice release, states that Morse admitted, acknowledged, and accepted responsibility for several specified facts. And those facts included incomplete implementation of the required controls, deficiencies involving a third-party email provider, missing documentation, including the absence of a consolidated written system security plan for a period, and the disparity between the submitted score and the later calculated score. So this case wasn't just about an arithmetic error. It involved a claimed cybersecurity posture that did not align with the organization's documented operating condition. So it would be easy to turn this Morse Corp case study into a warning about entering the correct number into SIPRs. But that would miss the larger lesson. This number was a symptom. The underlying issue was the absence of a sufficiently reliable process for verifying that the organization's representation was supported by the actual environment. And DOJ's civil cyber fraud initiative specifically targets conduct such as knowingly misrepresenting cybersecurity practices, knowingly providing deficient cybersecurity products or services, and knowingly violating incident monitoring or reporting obligations. So this False Claims Act also allows whistleblowers to bring actions on behalf of the government. So in the Morse Corp resolution, that whistleblower was awarded $851,000. And this reinforces a difficult reality. The audience for your cybersecurity representations is not limited to the contracting officer. We're talking about employees, former employees, vendors, consultants, primes, insurers, investigators, government assessors. They all might eventually compare your written claim with that evidence. And that's why defensibility requires more than just documentation. It requires governance. So the Department of Justice press release had several interesting quotes, but this one captures the attitude of the authorities within the Department of War and the Department of Justice best. So this is from the special agent in charge of that Morse Corp investigation. And he says that protecting the integrity of DoD procurement activities is a top priority for the DoD Office of Inspector General's Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and failing to comply with the DoD contract specifications and cybersecurity requirements puts DoD information and programs at risk. We will continue to work with our law enforcement partners and the Department of Justice to investigate allegations of false claims on DoD contracts. So that Morse Corp case study gives us that very public example involving the Department of Justice and the False Claims Act. But the DOJ is not the only party that might compare your cybersecurity representations with your operating condition. So the DOJ is one of the examples of government enforcement. We also have cyber insurance. So over the years, cyber insurance carriers' loss ratios started increasing a lot. So they're losing a lot of money. So that means that they had to adjust their policies. And insurance policies now are becoming increasingly more comprehensive, as the insurance companies are losing money over the years. And the result of that is that recently we've seen almost half of all cyber insurance claims being denied when these policyholders cannot produce the evidence that they are following all of the conditions of the policy. Or maybe a prime contractor might ask whether you fulfilled a cybersecurity obligations that were passed down to you through a subcontractor. And then another thing, we're also seeing a rise in what we're calling the cyber personal injury attorneys. I'm also calling them cyber ambulance chasers, right? And they're looking to file class action lawsuits from what they say on behalf of the breach victims. But what's actually happening is that this is proving to be a very lucrative business model for them. And we expect that trend to continue. And then, of course, your business and reputation can be positively enhanced with a robust cyber governance program in place. But if it's not in place, it could be enhanced negatively. But they all might ask some form of this question: can you prove what was actually implemented? And unfortunately, many organizations believe that their documents provide that defensibility by themselves. Now, documentation is, of course, necessary, but a defensible program needs policies. It needs a system security plan, that POAM, that plan of action and milestones. And these are all collected as evidence of your program. So again, policy can be approved without being followed. For example, an access control policy, which requires the termination of access with whenever an employees leave, but maybe accounts remain active for days, weeks, or longer because HR and IT and management don't have a reliable offboarding process. Or maybe that SSP, that system security plan, can be complete while describing an environment that no longer exists. So for example, maybe you add a new production facility, or you connect a new shop floor equipment, or maybe you move the email and file storage to a cloud provider. And then that POAM, right? That POAM is designed to list weaknesses and accepted risks. But if it lists these weaknesses that nobody is actively governing, that could be a problem. So for example, multi-factor authentication, right? MFA, maybe it's not implemented on several systems that handle CUI, controlled unclassified information. It has an owner and it has a target completion date, but that date passes. Or maybe operational constraints delay the project and nobody brings that issue back to leadership for a decision. This evidence can be collected immediately before an assessment rather than generated through normal operations. So for example, in preparation for an assessment, your team is on a scavenger hunt. They're spending several weeks gathering screenshots, access reports, training records, and other artifacts to prove that these controls are operating. And this evidence might satisfy the assessment, but there's no established process to collect and retain during normal operations. So 6 months later, much of it is outdated or maybe difficult to reproduce. So in other words, documentation is a representation of the program, but governance is the process that keeps that representation aligned with reality. And that distinction is important because static documents create a dangerous kind of confidence. Most documentation gaps are created by change. Maybe a new cloud service is introduced, or a manufacturing system is connected differently. Perhaps a privileged employee leaves. Your vendors are going to change and evolve. Perhaps you change your IT service provider or cloud provider. Leadership might assume that the vendor has it covered, while the vendor assumes that certain activities remain the customer's responsibility. And sometimes a security project is delayed because production cannot tolerate that downtime. These risk decisions change and they evolve, and each decision is understandable. But if your SSP and your SIPR score and your POAM and all this evidence is not updated, then your stated posture starts separating from the operating reality. And that's why that annual scramble is not enough. And the organization needs a cadence that identifies that change. It evaluates its effect. It assigns ownership, and it preserves the reasoning behind that decision. So in other words, the environment changes faster than the binder. And the answer is not more paperwork. It is a simpler, it's a repeatable operating model. So verify it to know what exists and whether it works. Govern it to make risks, ownership, priorities, and decisions visible. Prove it to preserve that evidence, showing the implementation and oversight. Again, talking about confidence. That confidence should come from a process, not an assumption. And most organizations, for example, would never allow financial statements to go untouched for a year and then attempt to reconstruct everything right before an audit. But That's often how we see cybersecurity being managed. So the framework only becomes real when it's on the calendar and it's given executive oversight. So a strong meeting or a strong governance cadence does not require a long technical meeting, just visibility into a small number of executive questions. This is how we govern cybersecurity in the Air Force. For example, what changed? What risks are visible? What's urgent? What's acceptable? Which requirements remain incomplete and who owns them? Has the environment recently changed? For example, new vendors like we discussed, or systems, or maybe a new production facility. What's blocking progress? Which decisions need leadership authority? Which risks are being accepted? And how are security projects being prioritized? Are there any constraints that we need to consider? Perhaps there's funding constraints, or maybe legacy equipment such as a CNC machine, computer numerical control machine, or an industrial control system that might have a hard time supporting a new security configuration without affecting that functionality or vendor support. So leadership has to understand these competing risks and make a deliberate decision. And does that evidence still support the claims that we're making? So again, the goal here is not a longer meeting. The goal is making better decisions. So now, by doing that, evidence now becomes a byproduct of governance. Governance doesn't mean that every risk is immediately eliminated. It means that risks are visible. It means that they're owned, deliberately addressed, and followed through. So hopefully that helped to shed some light on what a governance program is and why it's important. So you're probably thinking to yourself, yes, that was great, we get it. But what do I do during this pause? Or maybe you're asking, what will still matter after any possible rules change or after the program review is over? So let's briefly get into those questions here. So there's a lot of uncertainty in our world, not only in the CMMC program, but in our world right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. So the CMMC pause and review creates even more uncertainty. So the best thing you can do is to invest in certainty. I'm not talking about a shopping list, just priorities. So you can reduce uncertainty by clarifying the scope of your environment, identifying the stakeholders and risk owners, and understanding what's actually been implemented. And again, like, you always want to avoid single points of failure. And I did use the word always. Always avoid single points of failure. Address areas where either one employee or one vendor or any undocumented process carries too much risk. And then reduce your liability by prioritizing the biggest differences between your stated posture and that operating reality. And this way, you're making tangible progress and you're informing your decision-making. And so besides informing your decision-making and reducing uncertainty, I know many of you are wondering what will still matter after the pause and any possible rules changes. So here are 6 decisions that will survive any version of CMMC and set you up for success. 1, knowing where CUI exists. Again, controlled unclassified information, where it resides and who has access to it. So that concept is really simple, but a lot of it really does come down to that. And also separating your sensitive systems from unnecessary exposure. Recovering from disruption by having a plan. This is known as an incident response plan. So when was the last time that was reviewed? When was the last time you had a tabletop exercise to actually go through it and make sure that it is up to date and current and addresses the risks in your organization? Every organization is going to have a different incident response plan. So it needs to be tailored to you. Don't just Google it and download a template and call it good. It really does need to be tailored to you. Also, detecting material changes in your systems or environments. So for example, that new CNC machine or an inspection system is connected to the network. And during that installation, that vendor who's installing it, maybe they enable remote support. Maybe they create service accounts and they establish new network connections. So production is going to see that as an equipment installation. But from a cybersecurity perspective, that environment has now materially changed. And when that environment changes, What triggers a cybersecurity review? And then maintaining evidence of responsible oversight and ownership. So this is not just the technical documentation. This includes the evidence showing who knew, who owned it, what was decided, why it was decided, and whether or not anybody followed up. So let's put this through a practical decision filter. Before approving a cybersecurity expense, ask these questions. Does this reduce a material business risk? Not every cybersecurity weakness represents the same business risk. So governance helps leadership direct those limited resources towards the risks that matter most. Can we verify that it actually works? An example for this is a backup and recovery. So say you invest in a new backup solution. The dashboard that you have shows successful backups every night, but nobody has actually restored a critical system from those backups, which would confirm to the organization that it can recover when it matters. Will it produce evidence over time? So what I mean by this, for example, privileged access reviews. So if you have a quarterly process for reviewing administrative and privileged accounts, that means that you'll have a repeatable record showing who had access, who reviewed it, what changed, and when. So try to favor processes that don't just improve security today, they should also leave a trail demonstrating that the organization continues to manage risks tomorrow. Does leadership understands who owns it? So let's say a vulnerability is identified on a production system. If you have an MSP, the managed services provider, an outsourced IT provider, they might assume that the manufacturer will approve and schedule remediation. But operations assumes IT is handling it. Maybe you have an internal IT team and outsourced IT to augment them. Maybe your internal IT team assumes that the MSP owns patching. So this is a situation where everybody might know about the issue, but nobody's clearly accountable for getting it resolved. So if a vulnerability cannot be remediated today, who owns that risk? Who owns the remediation? Who has authority to decide what happens next? This is the distinction between doing the work and owning the outcome. Would we still value it if no assessment was scheduled? So if the only reason that we're doing something is because an assessor might ask about it, we should question our thinking. I had an example for that. Hold on. So for example, on this one, let's talk about your network segmentation, right? So if you're segmenting your network between business systems and manufacturing and OT, operational technology systems, separating those critical production systems from general business networks might help satisfy the cybersecurity requirements, but the real value here is reducing the ability of ransomware or of a compromised user account or another intrusion from spreading into systems that keep production running. So in this case, if CMMC disappeared tomorrow, we would still want to prevent that compromised office computer from becoming a pathway into production, but you still want to ask those questions, right? Does this really matter? And so now that you understand what decisions to make and how to filter them, let's start closing this conversation out by describing what defensible looks like. So defensible, what it looks like is if leadership knows what has been implemented. So for example, leadership has been told that MFA, multi-factor authentication, is implemented, but can they explain where it's actually enforced, which systems and users are covered, what exceptions remain, and whether or not anybody has verified the implementation? Are there any gaps that are visible, or, are all the gaps visible? That's really what we want. We want visibility into those gaps, and we want them to be owned. So you might know that a certain legacy systems can't meet a requirement. Happens all the time, just legacy systems. It does. But who owns that risk? And what are we doing in the meantime? When will it be resolved? We want these risk decisions to be documented. And sometimes accepting risk is a legitimate business decision. Just document that decision. For example, a change that might interrupt a critical production line. Leadership reviews the security risk and the operational impact, and they approve a temporary exception with compensating safeguards. They assign an owner. They establish a date for reconsidering the decision. That's what defensibility looks like for risk decisions being documented. Or maybe the system security plan is current. And as we've seen through the case study and examples today, there's risk in that gap between the stated posture and the operating reality. Is your SIPR's score supportable, unlike that case study we went over? If somebody challenged your score, could you show how you arrived at it, along with the evidence supporting it? And that evidence should accumulate through normal operations. We use the example of the quarterly reviews. So the goal here is to stop preparing evidence for an assessment and start operating in a way that naturally produces evidence. So you know that you have a defensible governance program when you're prepared for anything, whether it's an assessment, an incident, an insurer, a prime, an investigator, a litigator, doesn't matter, because you're prepared. You have the documentation, you have the evidence, you have the governance program. That's what we're after. So what should you do next? Well, ask yourself this question. Could we confidently support our current cybersecurity representations with evidence today? If that answer is unclear, begin with an executive conversation. So Strategic Value Plus and RTB Technologies, my company, we're both here to help determine that right path forward. So before we close, again, I want to thank Nell, Roy, the entire Strategic Value Plus team, the KDM Consortium for bringing this conversation together. One of the things that I really value about SVP is that they don't look at manufacturers through a single lens. So cybersecurity might be the issue that brought you to this session today, but it may not be the only issue limiting growth or resilience or performance. And SVP is great at understanding that broader business challenge and connecting you with the right expertise. So please take advantage of a no obligation executive conversation and contact us to set up a time to speak. And for organizations that want to begin with a cybersecurity question, we are offering a free executive CMMC exposure and liability briefing. So this is a 60 to 90-minute leadership discussion. It's not a technical audit. It is designed to help you identify what leadership should be asking. And then at the end, we'll provide a written executive observation summary that can further support your discussion with your board or your prime, your insurer, your legal counsel, or your internal team. So regardless of your strategic priority, the goal is to help you make the next decision with greater clarity and confidence. So let's start with the conversation. So you can type in a chat, to contact us. You can DM us on LinkedIn, send us an email, but let's get in touch. We would love to hear your story. And in the process, we'll build connections. We'll help you determine the best options for your situation. And if you're interested in discussing cyber liability, governance situation, or risks, again, we are offering that executive CMMC exposure and liability briefing for free. So let's get into those questions. Nell, how we doing?
Oh, we're doing great. Thank you so much, Jason. That was excellent. I love all of the examples that you provided for us, and which really showcases your experience in handling various types of circumstances where cybersecurity is ultimately important. And you have given me a new appreciation of how powerful consistent governance is. Yes, absolutely. And I loved all of your case studies too. They really bring the points home very powerfully. So, and I want to thank you again too for taking the time to be with us today. Really quality presentation. And I guess one of the first questions is, will we be able to share your slideshow with people who request it?
Yeah, well, we're recording this, right? I think it's going to be
Yes,
on
we are.
LinkedIn and YouTube.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
In LinkedIn and on YouTube. But the physical slide deck, is that also possible to share if people want to have it as a
Yeah,
referral?
I can make a shareable version for sure. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Again, contact us. Let's start that
Yeah,
conversation.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, that is the point. Okay, so I know there are lots of examples of situations where, and you gave us a very powerful one with where the Department of Justice really levied a multi-million dollar penalty on a company that um, didn't comply, and they were stating that their score was one, but in actuality, it was really a negative. Are
Right.
there are there others that kind of pop up that you can tell
I'm
us
sure
about?
we can Google them. We can chat
Yes,
GPT them. I mean,
yes,
there are
there
other examples. I won't
tons
go
of
in too
them.
much on
Yes.
specific examples.
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
trying to find a really relevant case
Sure.
for this,
Yes.
and it's certainly relevant.
Yes. Okay. Very cool. So we'll do that. And is there a case where that you can tell us about without disclosing the client, of course, that was the most interesting case to you?
Of a success or
Oh, how
you
about one of each? Yeah. How about one of each?
yeah, well, you know, it really does come down to culture.
Hmm.
Culture dictates everything on whether or not an organization is going to be successful. Your
Hmm.
most successful organizations have leadership that is involved. They have leadership that wants to understand. They want to assign risk owners. They want to know what kinds of risks to accept, which risks to mitigate, and
Hmm.
in some cases, which risks they transfer. You can do all
Hmm.
of those things.
Hmm.
The unsuccessful organizations are the ones that are pretending like nothing's going to happen. You know, they're the ones that want to avoid the situation.
Hmm.
You know, just talking
Hmm.
about risks, right? There's a few things that you can do with risks. You can
Hmm.
accept, you can mitigate, you can transfer, and you can avoid, right? And so if you're doing business with the government or and the whole purpose of this, I mean, there is certainly a defense industrial base, government contractual obligations that was like the basis for this. But this type of governance is applicable to any organization that handles sensitive information, whether it's client data, financial data, whatever it is. There are risks that you need to understand and accept. The organizations that are not successful are the ones that want to pretend like the risks don't even exist. The ones
Hmm.
who just want to bury their head in the sand and say, well, this is never going to happen to me. We're fine. It's always going to happen to somebody else.
Hmm.
So it's
Right.
always
Well.
about understanding, acknowledging, accepting, working through it. Whether
Hmm.
we're talking about cybersecurity governance or just any other operational issue, you always want to understand these issues and work through it.
Hmm. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So another question that comes up is you've given us plenty of decision making tools, and it's obvious you've really thought through all of these. And the first time I've felt like there was a system to governance that is
Yeah,
easy to understand. It's
right.
actually business oriented.
Yes,
Can you?
that is the key, and I do thank the Air Force, for this
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
leadership took it very seriously, and so
Hmm.
we were involved with briefing the base commander on progress for things.
Hmm.
They wanted to understand, how is the culture of our base coming
Hmm.
along? How are we protecting our weapon systems? Every
Hmm.
base has different weapon systems. Every base has
Hmm.
there's differences, and that is certainly applicable to any organization. So it always comes down to understanding what's going on in your organization, understanding who the
Hmm.
stakeholders are, understanding
Hmm.
who the risk owners are, who are the
Hmm.
decision makers. How do
Hmm.
decisions get made within that organization? What kind of bureaucracy do we need to go through while doing this? And
Hmm.
that's all about how you set up a good governance program. It comes
Hmm.
down to a meeting cadence. For example,
Hmm.
when we're new to an organization and we're first getting involved, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify the stakeholders, the risk owners, the decision makers, and we're going to have more frequent meetings at the beginning,
Mhm.
weekly, and then over time, and this is going to change from organization to organization. Over time, we're not going to need that weekly meeting anymore. It might change to bi-weekly, might change to monthly, eventually quarterly, right? So that depends on how, and that's the maturity model of the governance program.
Excellent, excellent. And so ultimately, we are protecting intellectual property, which is very important to all organizations.
Yes.
Don't want that. And
right. Absolutely.
and then also though, so in changing the culture, and also getting acceptance of the necessity to change. Do you get involved in any of that with organizations? Is that something
Absolutely.
that you, okay?
Absolutely. I want to be involved. That's what
Mhm.
that's what a fractional chief security officer is helping convey those risks at the organizational level, at the executive level, so they can understand what the business risks are for any kind of certain environment or situation.
And in some cases, in a lot of cases, it's beneficial to have an outside party be an influencer inside of an organization when there's change.
Fresh
It's
set of eyes.
necessary.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a fresh set of eyes for
Yeah.
sure. Oh, tell more about this exposure process, where you're the executive risk or compliance exposure.
Right.
What
Yeah.
does that process look like?
Well, it kind of like what I described in the briefing there, but it's a conversation. It's asking questions. It's really trying to understand where you are in your journey right now, and what your risks might be based on your current contractual obligations, based on the type of information that you have in your environment. We want to understand that stuff, and we do that through a conversation and asking questions, and then we'll put together that summary. And that summary is the written document that outlines what we went over and is very specific to your organization. And the purpose and the reason why it's free is because it's designed to help you have that conversation with your internal stakeholders.
That's key. Yes. If we're going to implement change and improvement, then we do have to have ownership, top to bottom, so that you don't have any weaklings along the way.
That's right. That's right.
That's excellent. So you've designed this so that it could be an agency or a way to make positive change inside of organizations.
That's exactly the
Right.
idea. Yeah, let's
Okay.
make positive change. Let's improve your organization. I mean, as you could probably tell, by going through these governance processes, you're going to have a stronger business at the end of the day also.
Yes, agreed. So if we were to approach a company, any suggestions as to how to start even thinking about having you come in and have these conversations? What
Right.
could we say? How could we introduce
and this is
them?
also where I'm leaning on SVP and your team.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
I mean, whether it's cybersecurity, which is where my expertise is, but you guys have experts in operations. You know how to navigate government incentives, tax write-offs, facility modernization. You guys are helping to build data centers, in a more green way, where you're not tapping into the water supply or the power grid. You understand robotics, AI, because at the end of the day, and why I love being part of this team is because we are part of the effort to help strengthen U.S. manufacturing as a whole, which is a national priority right now. I mean, we started discovering this during the COVID years, but over the past 30 years, our manufacturing has gone like this, China's has gone like this, and this is a national security issue. It's an economic security issue. And your team, the SVP team and the KDM consortium, you guys are embracing this challenge and wanting to improve the overall United States and the manufacturing within that. And I think it's incredibly exciting.
Well, thank you, Jason. I didn't mean to make that into a plug, but thank you so much. But yes, Yeah, the V Plus got together because we are passionate about strengthening the industrial base of the country and recognizing that it made sense and it was necessary, essential. There are too many manufacturers who are a little bit behind the curve. We need to bring them forward and help them take advantage of our technological skills and know-how and the tools that we have available to modernize them and also to augment what they're already doing with robotics because we do
Mhm.
have a workforce shortage in the country. We do
Right.
workforce training because it's necessary to have a workforce that understands technology and the cybersecurity tools that we use to help govern, and it will help augment the work that you do, Jason. Because we do use digital twins too to help augment what you do. But Jason's work and what he's telling us about is really a message that is poorly communicated. But I think today you've done a really excellent job of communicating the need, the necessity, and the why.
Well, thank
All
you
right.
for that
Yes.
feedback. I appreciate it. It's good to know that the message was received well, and it was great to put together. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed presenting it. So thank you
Yes.
for the opportunity.
And we enjoyed being in the audience learning from you. Any parting words before we close for the day?
Start with a conversation. That's it. Zero obligation. SVP, they're so great at understanding after that conversation which direction you should go. Right.
Right.
And then if you want to start with a cybersecurity conversation, you know how to do that as well. So get in contact with us and let's make things better.
All right. So I'm in the banner below. You have Jason's email, and you can also contact Strategic Value Plus to learn more about the exposure tool and that conversation that's so important to have. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Jason. Excellent program. And we will see you all next time. Join us the third Wednesday next month for another excellent presentation. Thank you, Jason. We'll be talking.
Sounds good.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
you.